All right, good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming. It's my honor to present the final share of this term. I was asked to mention this. All the learning today is sponsored by Mark and Deborah Zohar for the Ilui Nishmat, for the Yortzeit of Mark's parents, Kalman Chaim Ben Tzvi and Esther Bat Moshe. Both of his Yortzeits fall in the coming week. So all the learning we'll do this morning, the Ilui Nishmatam. Topic today, topical for this time of year, is about rebuilding the Mikdash. I think that if we think about one of the most famous statements, one of the most famous sentences of Chazal relating to this time of year is what we find in the Gemara, we find in the Yerushalmi, that says, Kol dor shelo nivna beit hamikdash beyamav ki'ilu hichrivo. Every generation in which the Mikdash has not been rebuilt, and it's not yet been rebuilt, it is as if that generation has destroyed it. It's as if that we are right now destroying it, causing it to be destroyed by our actions. And the question, of course, is what are those actions that have caused it to be destroyed, and how can we change them? How can we correct them in order to build it? Now, Chazal give us explanations behind this. They give us in two types of reasons. It's very interesting. On the one hand, we find, and I'm not going to talk about this at length today, we spoke about it in a previous year, but we find throughout Chazal, different Gemarot, broad principles, broad explanations. The Beit HaMikdash was destroyed because of A, B, and C, right? The most famous, Gilui Arayot, Shvichut Damim, Sinat Chinam, etc. There are other explanations as well. That's one category. But we find as well that Chazal went in a different route to explain to us. They told us stories. They told us stories, they gave us examples of specific occurrences which happened, and they said, because of this, the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed. Because of that, Yerushalayim was destroyed. And it seems very, very strange. You have an anecdote, you have a historical anecdote. There was a party somewhere, there were two people, had a bit of a fight, and because of that, the entire Jewish people goes into exile for centuries. It seems a little bit far-fetched. So have a look at the handout you've got in front of you. Source number 1, Rav Weiss in his Sichot on the Muadim, on the shiur that he gave for Tisha B'Av, he talks about this. He says what Chazal are trying to teach us is the following. Chazal want us to not look at historical causes, geopolitical causes. Those things may be relevant as well, and there may be a place for that. But there's something far deeper. The question is, what is the spiritual cause? What is the spiritual root? What are we doing? What have we been doing? So we look at these stories. The story is giving us a prototype. It's giving us an example. It's teaching us about the behavior that existed, the type of society that existed, and the type of society that we have to correct. So source number 1, he says, he's relating to a very, very famous story, which we'll get to in a moment. Before we get into anything, before we get into the story, we see something here that Chazal teach us. He says, they're talking about the destruction. They're talking about the cause of the exile. And again, you could analyze it as a historical story, and you could see the battles and the military, and so you had the military analysts in those days like you have in these days, and they should have conquered this, and they should have fought here, etc. But he says that's not what Chazal tell us. That's not what interests them. יותר ממה שהסוגיה הזו עוסקת ברשעת הבבלים והרומיים שהחריבו את ביתנו ושרפו את היכלנו וחירפו וגידפו כלפי מעלה. We don't find that the Gemara talks about how evil the Babylonians were and how evil the Romans were. There are elements of that, but that's not the main focus. We focus on what did we do wrong? What were the mistakes that we made? What were the chataim? Right? Which ultimately brought upon us this destruction. We don't just remember the destruction. We don't just remember the fact those who sent us out into exile. There are places and there are times when we have that, by the way. We have a mitzvah, I'm sure you all remember, to remember Amalek. Remember what Amalek did to you. There we do have to remember. But the reason we have to remember, maybe, is because we need to remember that evil exists in the world so that we know how to fight against, or we know that we have to fight against it. We've seen in our days how easy that is to forget, how many people miss that message. But that's one aspect. But here there's something deeper. This is a time of reflection. It's a time of tshuva. It's a time we have to find what we have done wrong and how we can fix that. And that's the root of it. So what I want to do this morning, I want to just learn together with you a story, which you all know, I'm sure, But it's a story that every time we open it up, there are so many layers to Torah. We look at the story and maybe look at it from perspectives that we haven't seen before. Maybe read through critically, ask the questions, ask what it's doing here, ask that. There are so many unanswered questions in the story. And as we explore, as we can try and understand, gain a deeper understanding for how it relates to all of us practically. Today, the story is Kamsa and Bar Kamsa. We've all heard the story of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa. Very, very strange names we'll get to in a moment, but the Gemara in Gittin. What I suggest, let's begin. Let's read through the story. Let's read it together. Again, with an open mind, critical thought. I'm going to afterwards open it up to the floor for questions that people have about the story. We won't be able to answer all of them, but we can pull out some things that can help us understand really what are Chazal trying to teach us, and how can we change our lives, and how can we live our lives based on the lessons that we learn here. The first thing I'll say, just before we start reading inside, is that you read a story like this. And what does everybody want to do? What's the first question that you ask yourself is, whose fault was it? Right? Who is wrong over here? And we're very good, spoke about this on Shabbos, but we're very good at pointing fingers at other people, at finding fault with other people. In fact, one of the themes of the story is that when you read through, you'll notice everyone in the story blames somebody else. Nobody is willing to take responsibility for what they did. And it may be that other people are at fault as well. Other people have responsibility, but there's nothing I can do about somebody else's responsibility. I cannot force them to take responsibility, but I can force myself, I can take responsibility for what I've done wrong. And if the way that we look at it, if our perspective is, I'm perfect, but look what they've done, and I'm perfect, and look at what he's done, and I'm perfect, and look at what she's done, then we're never going to get anywhere. And I think that's part of the message, exactly what Chazal are teaching us in the story. I think, this comes up because it's also not clear. When we read the story, we'll say, who's at fault? It's not. There are many possibilities. There are many characters you could blame. And part of the reason it's ambiguous, I think, is on purpose. You look at, for example, the story of Mechirat Yosef, the selling of Yosef in Chumash Bereshit. So who's responsible? Whose fault was it? Who sold him? Even the very question of who was the one who picked Yosef up from the bar and sold him off as a slave? We don't know the answer to that. It might have been the brothers. It might have been that, according to the Rashbam, they didn't plan to sell him at all. A band of traveling nomads came past. They picked him up. They came back to the pit. He wasn't there. We don't know. Why is the text so ambiguous? Maybe it's ambiguous. Part of the reason is whether it was you who did it directly to the final act or not, you all bear some responsibility. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter whose fault it was. It was everybody's fault to a certain degree. It's the same thing in our days. If we get through Tisha B'Av, and all I can think of in Tisha B'Av is how much other people are at fault, I've completely missed the point. But let's look through, and again, there are different elements, and as I said in a previous year as well, there will be different elements of responsibility and different things which different people have done. They may not all relate to me specifically, individually. But the question is, I read through, what are the things that I am at fault for? Where can I take responsibility? Okay. So let's read the Gemara, source number 2. And as I say, keep an open mind and think about the questions which will pop up. There are many questions that pop up. So the Gemara in Gittin says like this. It says, Akamtza ubal kamtza chaluv Yerushalayim. Over Kamtza and Bar Kamtza, Yerushalayim was destroyed. Already in that heading, there is a lot to be unpacked. Remember, it's Kamtza and Bar Kamtza. Okay, and the story goes as follows. The Hau Gavra, the Rachme Kamtza, Ubadavave Bar Kamtza. There was a certain individual, Hau Gavra, the Gemara calls him. He had an ally who was called Kamtza, and he had an enemy who was called Bar Kamtza. Okay, first question at this point, the first question that jumps out at me is, who is Hau Gavra? He's one of the central characters in the story, this host. We don't know who he is. He doesn't have a name. Very, very strange. Whoever he is, okay, but he has, that's how we begin. And says the Gemara, Avad Seudata. So he had a meal, he had a Seudah, he had a feast, he had a banquet, maybe he had a dinner, maybe he was fundraising, I don't know what it was, but he had a big event. Amar le Shame. So he said to his servant, Zil aitili Kamtza. Go and invite Kamtza. Go and tell Kamtza to come to the party. Azal aitile Bar Kamtza. And the servant went and he brought Bar Kamtza. Okay. So what do we think? It's an innocent mistake. It could have happened to anybody, right? So already at this point, I'll challenge. I think the Shamei, the servant, maybe he gets off a little bit easy. If he is a close attendant of this person. The Gemara begins by telling us this person, he had friends, he had enemies. Presumably he's a wealthy person, he's a well-to-do. This person manages his affairs, or is at the very least somewhat involved. He knows this is a big deal. It's not just that happens to be a Bar Kamsa, as we'll see from the rest of the story. It's not just somebody that he doesn't like. There's something going on between them. And therefore, the servant should know a little bit better. At the very least, he should know that Bar Kamsa is not, at least ask a question, yeah.
Are they father and son? Is that, Chazal say that? Or, yeah.
So that's very, very interesting. The Ben Yehoyada says that. The Ben Yehoyada says that these names Kamsa and Bar Kamsa, he says that Bar Kamsa was actually the son of Kamsa.
It shows up still disconnecting family.
Yeah, very much.
The second reason, during this time of the census.
Very much, very much so.
You're not making it clear. You have to tell us this person and this person. We're not understanding people that don't understand Hebrew. Or when you're reading the Hebrew.
Right. Okay. So there's all right. So there's okay. So there are four people so far. There are 4 people who have been mentioned in the story. In fact, 4 people have been mentioned, but only 2 of them have appeared in the story so far. There are 2 people called Kamsa and Bar Kamsa. Okay. Then there is a third person. There is the host. He's nameless. The host of the party is nameless. We don't know his name. The Gemara doesn't tell us. The Gemara just says Hau Gavra, which means that man. So there was that man. That man is hosting a party. What we know is that this person who is hosting the party, he has a friend. He has an ally who is called Kamsa. He has an enemy who is called Bar Kamsa. Bar Kamsa may be the son of Kamsa. We don't find that. It doesn't say that anywhere explicitly, but it's an interesting point. Again, the names are very, very similar. The word Bar in Aramaic is Ben in Hebrew, which means he is the son of, like Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, right? So it could be, but we'll leave that for the moment. And then there is the servant. There's the attendant, the one who's going out, who's handing out the invitations to the party. So the host says to his servant, I want you to go and invite my ally, my friend, Kamsa, to come to the party. The servant goes and he invites Bar Kamsa. Okay, he invites the enemy, he invites the wrong person. We'll see in a moment what happens when the wrong person comes to the dinner. Okay, but I was just making the point that you could read it and you could say, okay, he wasn't listening, he wasn't paying attention, he thought Kamsa, he thought Bar Kamsa, he didn't hear what. I think that if we're honest and we think about it, it makes more sense. It's more reasonable to suggest that he should have known better, that he should have understood that it's a very strange thing. He's going to invite his enemy to this party. At the very least, ask the question, excuse me, Mr. Hau Gavra, are you sure you want to invite him? What's going on? Yeah.
Maybe he was handing out the invitation. She knocks on the door. The person answers, are you Kamsa? Yes. Hands it to him. I got the invitation. I'm Kamsa. I got the invitation. So he took it and went.
You're saying he went to the right person, but he...
He doesn't know what the guy looks like. He knocks on the door. The person answers the door. It could be like a person with a different name. So he asks, are you Kamsa? And the person answers, yes, because I'm the son of Kamsa, so I'm also Kamsa. And she said, boy, I'm family of Kamsa, whatever. I'm Kamsa.
Okay.
Boy, Kamsa, I'm Kamsa, yeah. So he hands him the invitation and walks away and doesn't know the difference between one and the other.
Okay, maybe that's interesting. It's a novel approach. I've never heard that before, but it's possible. Yeah, okay. No, we don't know his name. He's called Hau Gavra, and it's remarkable because he's one of the most central characters in the story. Okay, we'll come back to the names a little bit later on. So we're now on the third line. As far as we know, no, we aren't told. It's possible they were. It's possible they weren't. We don't know. Again, there's a lot more about the story that we don't know than that we do know. But let's continue. So we say Ata. So he goes. He comes. In other words, Bar Kamsa, the enemy, comes to this event. Ashkachei dahava yativ. And the host sees that he's sitting there, right? This is his big day, this is big dinner, there's been months and months of planning that's gone into this. And he sees his enemy sitting there. And he says, Amarle mikte hau gavla, bar de bavei de hau gavlau, mai baitacha, kumpuk. So I'll translate. He walks up to him. The host comes along to Bar Kamsa, and essentially he says, what are you doing here? Right? And not in the most polite way. He says, you're not my friend, you're my enemy, you shouldn't be here. Kum puk. Get up and go. Get out. Okay? Now this is where things start to take a downward spiral. Amarle, ho'il ve'atai. Bar Kamsa says, look, I'm here. I've come. If it was in the first place. Interestingly, that he doesn't say to him, Again, the whole thing, why doesn't he just turn to him and say, what am I doing here? You invited me. That's why I'm here. But he doesn't say that. He says, he says, since I'm here, he says, I'm here already, just please, just let me stay. I'll pay for my meal. I'll pay for everything I've eaten, everything I've drank. I'll pay for you, just let me stay. Amar le, lo. He says, no. Amar le yahivna lach d'mei palga de sudatayich. He says, okay, this is about money. This is about, this is a financial thing. You know what? I'll pay you for half of the event. Amar le lo. He says, no. So Bar Kamsa says, okay, look. He says, I will pay you for the entire meal, for the entire banquet, thousands and thousands of shekels, however much it costs. I'll pay. Just please don't embarrass me. You read these words, you can hear the pleading, you can almost feel the sense of embarrassment. He's turning red in the face. It's in the middle of the event. He's making a big scene. He's saying, please, I'm here. Just let me stay. Amar le, you all know the answer. Look, he says no. He picks him up and he takes him out. Whether he picked him up, he got the guards or whatever, but he takes him and he takes him out of the banquet. Okay, that's the first part of the story. Now, yeah.
You said a few minutes ago that he didn't say anything in the beginning, like, wait a minute, I have an invitation. You look,
right?
Or he didn't bring it with him, but he says, I have an invitation. Your servant brought it to me,
right,
to invite me here. So I don't know what you're talking about. Why didn't that transaction happen?
Okay, so that's a very good question. Either it happened and we aren't told about it, or we're not. The fact that we're not told about it suggests that it didn't happen, and that's already a question, right? You can ask. The whole. Well, we're dealing with the question now. That's why we're studying, right? The whole interaction that takes place is bizarre. He's like, Bar Kamsa, he knows he's an enemy of this person. So you're coming in. What's the first thing you're going to do? You're going to come to the banquet. You're going to bring your gift. You're going to go up to so and so, and you're going to say to Mr. Hau Gavra, who's hosting the party, right? And you say, thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me. This can be the beginning of our approachment. This can be the beginning of. But he doesn't do that. He just goes and he sits down and eats. And then the person comes up to him, and seemingly this is exactly that opportunity to start, to say, okay, look, whatever happened between us is water under the bridge. Let's, bygones be bygones, whatever you want to say, find the appropriate cultural expression here. And let's carry on. But he doesn't say that. None of that happens. So maybe he knows that he shouldn't actually be there. Maybe he understands, Mr. Bar Kamsa, that there is a reason why he is hated and why now it just turns into something about his embarrassment, his shame. Okay, there's a lot unanswered here. Yeah, somebody had a question.
The man, Bar Kamsa, comes and they want to throw him out. That is the utmost embarrassment. There isn't very much you could do after that.
Right. So let's see what happens after that. So now he's been thrown out. So now Bar Kamsa has been thrown out. He's been thrown out. He's been embarrassed. They've wiped the floor with him, and he's gone. So what's he going to do? So listen to what he says. He says, we're in the second paragraph here. It says, Amar, the paragraphs, by the way, don't appear in the Gemara. I just put it that way to make it easier for us to follow. Amar ho'il v'havu yatvei rabbanan v'lo machube. Bar Kamsa says to himself, there were rabbis sitting at this event. It's always the rabbi's fault, right? So the rabbis were sitting there. They didn't say anything. They saw what was going on. They saw that Mr. Hau Gavra was throwing me out of his event. They saw I was being embarrassed. They did nothing. Why didn't they stand up and say, hey, what are you doing to him? Leave him alone. So therefore, he says, okay, that is proof. That is proof for me that these rabbis were happy. They weren't bothered by what he was doing, by the fact that he embarrassed me. Which you could translate colloquially as basically, I'll show them. I'm going to go now to the king. I'm going to go to the Roman emperor, and I'm going to snitch on them, essentially. And he says like this. So Bar Kamsa now goes to the Caesar. He goes to the Roman emperor, and he says the following. He says, Mardubach Yehudai, the Jews are rebelling against you, against the empire. Amarle miyama. The emperor says, what are you talking about? Says who? Amarle shada lahu kubana. He says, I'll prove it to you. Bar Kamsa says, send them a korban, send them a sacrifice. You know, when we had the Beit HaMikdash, it wasn't just OUisrael who brought korbanot. The non-Jews of the world could come along and they can send offerings to the Beit HaMikdash as well. So he says, send them a korban, send them in the name of Rome. Chazit makrivinle. And you'll see if they are going to offer it up, if they'll sacrifice it. Azel shadal bidei igla tilta. He sends a calf as a sacrifice. Bahade dekate shada bei muma. Now what? So what happens? The Roman emperor says, "Fine, I'll send a korban. I'll send an offering. You, Bar Kamsa, will be my shaliach. You'll transport the offering." And then what does Bar Kamsa do? He takes the offering and the animal and he inflicts a blemish, a mum. Benif svatayim v'amune badokin sheba'ayin. So there are those who say, where did he cut the animal? Where did he make a blemish? Either on the lips, either on its upper lip, or inside its eye, in the eye of this animal. Now, what's unique about both of these places? Duchta deledidan havamuma uledidu lav mumahu. Very interesting. According to our laws, we consider this to be a blemish in the animal. But according to the Romans, they would not have considered that to be a blemish. That's why they didn't know. Okay, at this point, the question we can ask is, what was Bar Kamsa thinking? What was he thinking? Okay, I understand you were offended, you were insulted, you were embarrassed. You talk about the ultimate case of cutting off your nose to spite your face, right? You're going to go and you're going to inflict whatever it is going to be on the Jewish people. You're going to be affected as well. What's going on here? Okay, maybe this tells us a hint. Maybe this gives us a little bit of a hint into who this character of Bar Kamsa was. If we think through the story, it all starts to add up. Okay. So now what happens? By the way, this is, when we learn the story in school, and we learn the story in Gan, in kindergarten, very often this is where they end the story. But this is not the end of the story. There's a continuation, which is very, very important. And it says like this. So this has now happened. The party has taken place. Okay, Bar Kamsa has been thrown out. They've mopped the floor with him. He's now gone to take his revenge. He's gone and he's slandered against the rabbis and the Jewish people, against the Roman emperor. They've got the korban. Now the rabbis have to decide what to do. They have this korban. What are they going to do with it? They know what's gone on. So Savo Rabbanan likruve mishum shlom malchut. Now there are many things that we do. We have a concept of shlom malchut. We don't want to. Nowadays it's a little bit different. But in those days, especially when you have a government or you have that is in charge of you, that has the power of life and death, and there are certain things that we wouldn't normally do, but in order not to offend, we're allowed to. There are loopholes so they said maybe we have a korban that has a blemish, we can't bring that up on the mizbeach. But for the sake of Shlom Malchut, maybe we're allowed to. Maybe we're allowed to in order so as not to cause antagonism towards the empire. Amalu Rabbi Zcharia ben Avkulas, one of the sages, Rabbi Zcharia ben Avkulas. We don't hear about him very often. We hear about him in a couple of places, 2 or 3 places, I think, throughout the entire Gemara. But Rabbi Zcharia ben Avkulas says, Yomru ba'alei mumin krevin lagabei mizbeach. He says they're going to say, you're going to bring this korban. People will say, you can bring any animal. It has a blemish. You can bring it as a korban. So they can't do that. So they said, Savu lemiktele dolo lezel velema. So they thought, okay, here's another idea. If nobody goes and tells the Romans that we didn't bring the korban, then there's no problem. Who's going to go and tell them? Only one person, Bar Kamsa. So maybe we should kill him. Okay? Maybe he has what's called a din rodef. Okay, and he is endangering the entire Jewish people. If he is put to death, then he won't be able to endanger anyone. Amalu Rabbi Zcharia ben Avkulas yomu meitil mum bakochim yaleg. Says Rabbi Zcharia, you can't do that. The same Rabbi Zcharia. He says, because then people are going to think that if you make a blemish on the korbanot, that's punishable by death. We don't want people to think that. Okay. And now the Gemara says the most surprising statement of the whole story. It says, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan says, okay, you know what the Musar Haskel, you know what the lesson is from the story of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa? You know whose fault it is? Not Kamsa, not Bar Kamsa, not Haugavra, none of them. It's Rabbi Zcharia. Amar Rabbi Yochanan and v'tanuto. Rabbi Zcharia ben Avkulas, because of the anava, because of the humility of Rabbi Zcharia ben Avkulas, hechriva et beiteinu, safat echaleinu, vigletanu me'atzenu. That is what caused us to be, caused the Beit HaMikdash to be destroyed, caused the Echal to be burnt down, and caused us to go into exile. Okay, and then the Gemara goes on and tells other stories and tells about the military conquest, etc. Okay, That's the story of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa, basically. Many questions over here. And particularly we think about the question of, who is responsible? Where did things go wrong? Why did things go so wrong? How is this a message for all of us? Okay, so there's a few different angles to unpack here. At this point, again, I know we've spoken a little bit throughout the story, but I'm going to open it up here to the floor at this point. Just questions that have been raised throughout the reading of the story that we haven't addressed yet. Yeah. Yes. Excellent. Excellent. Right, exactly. That, I think, to my mind, I'll repeat the question, but to my mind, that is maybe the number one, the striking question of the story. I always feel bad. I always say, whenever I learn the story, I always feel bad for Kamsa. Because what did Kamsa do? He's not here. He's not in the story. He wasn't there. He never heard about it. If we accept the interpretation that Kamsa and Bar Kamsa, father and son, okay, maybe it makes sense.
It was his responsibility to be Makarev and to bring shalom between the two people, and he didn't do it.
Right. Okay. So very much that could be, and that is one interpretation. There are others who say no, they're strange names, but it happens. Sometimes people have similar names. So he's a complete stranger. So the question was, and again, the Gemara introduces it. Every word here in the Gemara is chosen intentionally. Right. Akamtza ubar kamtza charuv Yerushalayim. If it was up to me, I would have said, it's because of Ha'u Gavra and Bar Kamsa that Yerushalayim was destroyed, right? Who were the enemies? The enemy was the host of the party and Bar Kamsa, but we don't even know the host's name. So if we forget about him and we say because of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa, that implies because of what these two individuals did, that's why Yerushalayim was destroyed. But it's not what Kamsa did, because Kamsa is not in the story. He doesn't appear. He's nowhere to be found. Okay, that's one question. Yeah. Sorry, Dale. Yes.
Could you just kind of clarify where he fits into the story? Because I'm not sure I understand it.
Okay. So we'll get to more after, but essentially the story is as follows: we have the party, we have Kamsa Bar Kamsa. Bar Kamsa runs out. He's very, very upset. He's very angry. He decides he's going to go and concoct a story and tell the Romans that the Jews are rebelling against them. If the Romans think the Jews are rebelling against them, what's going to be the outcome? We all know what the outcome is going to be, and it's not pretty. So, at the point where he concocts the story, he has the korban, and he's put the mum in it. Now, we're still okay. Where are things going to go downward very, very quickly? When Bar Kamsa goes back to the Romans and he says, "You sent them a korban. Here's the proof." They wouldn't bring it up. So at this point, the rabbis are discussing what to do. And they say there are two ways to avoid this. Either we can bring the korban anyway, or we can remove Bar Kamsa from the equation so that he can't. And both of those suggestions that are made, Rabbi Zechariah is the one who says, no, you can't do that, and you can't do that. So they end up doing nothing, and the result is destruction.
They did nothing. Just like at the party,
They did nothing? No, we'll see. Yeah.
Okay, this was a mistake, but they brought it to him. He could have co-opted him and prevented the rest of it.
Yeah.
To say, okay, this was a mistake. Here's my chance to turn an enemy into a friend.
Right.
And therefore, the rest of the story would have been a total different.
Right. That's essentially Bar Kamsa's claim, right? That's what he's saying. Why don't you? I'm here. Why can't you just let go? And he doesn't do that. Yeah.
I think we're learning this because to bring it to the present time, I have a neighbor who used to be religious, and he likes matzah, so I bought him matzah, and he wants to make matzah bride for me. I don't want to embarrass him, so I say, I already have supper. I try to get out of not embarrassing him. And little by little, he's becoming Shomer Shabbat. So you never know. You can embarrass somebody. He could say something to all the neighbors in your building, in which case they'll ignore you. Or you could try to do something to bring this person closer to what he should be.
Could be, yeah.
We don't have a korban to bring now.
Right.
We certainly can concentrate on being nice to other people.
Yes.
I told him it's the outside of Aaron this week, and we learned Ohev and Rodev Shalom.
Yes, definitely. That will certainly be one of the lessons that we learn here. Yeah.
rabbis, Zechariah and Yochanan, were at the banquet.
That's interesting. There are versions, there are those who say that yes, that Rabbi Zechariah ben Avkulas and his Anava is referring to. It's not explicit in our text, but there is such an idea. Yeah, that's possible. Okay, so there's a lot, as I said, there's a lot here to unpack. Let me suggest one interpretation which we find in a number of the Farshim, and then we'll go back and we'll look at some other ways of reading the story as well. But something maybe very interesting and very very surprising, and it can help us understand Rabbi Zechariah and help us understand the whole thing is this. Bar Kamsa. Yeah, I'll get back to Kamsa. But if I was to ask you, what kind of based on what we know about him, based on the very little the Gemara has told us, but it's given us a bit of an insight into the character. What kind of a person do you think that Bar Kamsa is? Not great. He's vengeful.
Honor and pride is very, very important to his honor.
Right. In other words,
The fact that he wants to get revenge like this, to me, that
right.
He's friends with the emperor.
Friends with the emperor, maybe, right? In other words, the Gemara, whatever way, the Gemara here does not present Bar Kamsa quite as the Tzaddik Hador. Let's put it that way, right? And in fact, I mean, you look at what goes on. First of all, from the time that he receives his invitation, he comes to this banquet party, whatever it is, it's all about money. He says to the person, why doesn't he go up to him? Why doesn't he try and make amends? Why doesn't he try and make peace? Why doesn't he try and say, at least, you sent me an invitation? He does none of that. Maybe it's because he knows that actually the person has a grievance against him and that it's a legitimate grievance. After all, this is the individual who's willing to throw everything out, that a little bit, my honor, I was hurt a little bit, I'm going to go and I'm going to get no less and have the entire Jewish people thrown into exile. Okay, maybe he didn't think it would go that far when he went to the emperor, but surely he knew something was coming, right? That's why he did it. So he doesn't seem to be somebody great, right? Maybe part of the message over here, again, and I say this first, I don't think this is the only message that we need to learn, but maybe it's a little bit counterintuitive, but maybe this is why when we get to the end, we get to Rabbi Zechariah ben Avkulas, right? And then the Gemara says, Rabbi Yochanan said at the end of the story, he said, "Anvetanuto shel Rabbi Zechariah ben Avkulas echriva et beitenu." He didn't say it was the indecision of Rabbi Zechariah ben Avkulas that caused this. He says it was the humility. What's humility got to do with it here? Why is that the essence? So have a look at source number 5. It's on your second page. Again, this is from Rav Asher Weiss. He suggests like this. He says, "Neredi kardato shel Rabbi Zechariah." Right? You can ask the question, really. What was Rabbi Zechariah thinking? I asked before, what was Bar Kamsa thinking? But what was Rabbi Zechariah thinking? Surely he understood what the consequences of this would be. So he says, "Mitov libo ve'eno atova lo hamin sheyesh kan kesher shel reshaim ve'kavana lezer beikotza etzel hamalchut." He says, why does it say the anava of Rabbi Zechariah? Says Rav Asher Weiss, maybe Rabbi Zechariah was the person who had a good heart, he had a good eye, he judged everybody very, very favorably. He couldn't believe that Bar Kamsa would be such a rasha that he would go and he would slander against the Jewish people to the Roman emperor. How could you go that far? That's unthinkable. והאמין שאין כאן אלא מקרה שנפל מום בקורבן והשליח איש תמים הוא ואין כל חשש שהמסרה למלכות. So maybe he thought, when he says, you can't do this because people will think that you can bring korbanot with a mum, you can't do this, people will think somebody who puts a mum in a korban is going to be chayv mitah, is going to be subject to death. It couldn't be. You tell him the story and he says, no, there's no way that that's actually what happened, that this individual is now going to go and he's going to tell the Romans. I don't believe that will happen. Right? ואין כאן חשש שהמסירה למלכות, משום כך הייתה דעתו נחרצת שאין להרכיב את הקורבן ואין להרוג את השליח. He says, therefore he was insistent. You can't kill this shaliach and you can't go and you can't bring this korban. In other words, what's the worst that's going to happen? Not what happened, obviously. והוא שאמר ביוחנן אנבטנותו של רבי זכריה בן אבקולס החריבה את ביתנו, שרפה את היכלנו והגליתנו מארצנו, דהיינו טוב ליבו ואינו הטובה. He says sometimes, and he goes on and he brings further support for this. But sometimes if the person that we're dealing with, the Bar Kamsa, is in fact the Rasha that it sounds like he is, he's an evil person. He's mechutz lemachaneh. Somebody who's willing to go because he felt a little bit of a slight to his own honor. He's willing to go and he's willing to incriminate the entire Jewish people and need to, even if he doesn't think maybe that it's going to go that far, but he thinks, he knows surely something's going to happen. So such a person, maybe we don't have to, maybe it's not possible to make shalom with such a person. It's not. Sometimes we have to know that I'm facing a situation, I'm facing an impossible situation. There's somebody here who really has gone over to the other side, let's say, and there's nothing that we can do. It's a completely different way of looking at the story. The problem with this interpretation, I'll tell you, I think it's true. The problem is that most people, certainly in our society today, are very, very quick to judge and very, very quick to say, that person, he's bar kamsa. Right? This is an extreme example. This is an extreme case. Most of the people that we have disagreements with, most of the people that we have arguments with, are not to the extent, of bar kamsa. We should get over those arguments. We should find a way to but what the Gemara is telling you at the end was Rabbi Yisrael ben Avkola. Sometimes there are people, sometimes there are extreme examples and extreme situations where you cannot get over it. Bar kamsa is a rasha. He's out of the picture. Okay. I think part of our problem and part of the lesson is we think everybody's like that. We think everybody's out of the picture. There's a famous Netziv, the Netziv of Volozhin, who has an introduction to Sefer Bereshit, to Chumash Bereshit. And he writes there that this was exactly the problem during Beit Sheni. He says during Beit Sheni, everybody, they were tzaddikim, they were righteous people, they were Hasidim, they were pious people, they did all the mitzvot, they learned Torah, they did chesed, everything was wonderful. You know what the problem was? The Gemara says sinat chinam. He says, you know what sinat chinam means? It means that you see the person who wears a different color kippah to you, or wears a different kind of hat to you, or wears different, things are a little bit different. You say he's an apikoros, and he's a tzduki, and he's bar kamsa, and he's out of the picture. He doesn't say bar kamsa, but I'm just comparing this story to what he says over there. He says anybody who's a little bit different than them, they said he is out of the camp. They said he's not somebody we have to try and make shalom with. We're too. The problem is the people that we should try and resolve with, we don't, and the people that we shouldn't, we do. Right? That's the problem. So that's number one. That's something that we have to identify, and that's something that we have to get better at. Okay, but that's in terms of maybe Rabbi Zcharia. But let's go back to kamsa. Okay, right? We asked the question. So what did kamsa do wrong? Kamsa is not here. Kamsa is not part of the story. And what the Maharal says, he says something beautiful. He says what the Gemara is trying to teach you, and when it says that we have a kamsa ubar kamsa Charuv Yerushalayim. Do you know what it means that Yerushalayim was destroyed because of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa? It doesn't mean because there was an anecdote, because there was such an event in such a hall, on such a date, at such a time, and this thing happened. That's just an example. But when you have a reality of Kamsa or Bar Kamsa, a reality of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa means that there is such division, that there is such strife, that the society is built in such a way that everybody has their camp. And everybody has their allies and has their enemies, right? And I have my kamsas in my life and I have the bar kamsas in my life. You can imagine outside this party, people were probably standing there holding up signs that said Rak lo kamsa or Rak lo bar kamsa, right? The names are almost identical. Why? Because whether they're father and son or whether they don't know each other, it doesn't matter. The point is, there's only two letters here that differentiate between these two individuals. Where at the end of the day, we're so similar. At the end of the day, there's not always that much which is different between us. But you know what? You're my ally and you're my enemy. Why? Kacha. I don't like you. You're out of the picture. And that was the reality. Everything was so divided. Everybody had their faction and everybody had their camp and everybody had, we see this, if this sounds familiar, we see this in sports. We see this in politics. In Israel, the two are the same thing. Politics is the national sport. It's the only one we're good at, and even that one we're not so good at. But that's when it's about issues, and when it's about values, and when it's about I can have a disagreement with somebody, but we can talk and we can be civil, that's okay. But any time, it's like the Netziv says, somebody who doesn't think exactly the same thing that I think, they're my enemy, well then from there the spiral downwards is very, very quick and is very, very sharp. And that's what the Gemara says, that's what the Maharal says, Akamta ubar kamsa charuv Yerushalayim. When your society is such that everybody has their allies and everybody has their enemies, and anybody who's not exactly the same is my enemy and is michutz lemachaneh. And again, notwithstanding what I said, sometimes there is such an individual, sometimes there can be extreme cases. But those are extreme and those are few and far between. They're not everywhere and everything. That is the cause. It's not that this individual named Kamsa, he may have existed, he may not have existed. The Gemara might just be telling us a story. But the reality of Kamsa bar Kamsa is something that caused the destruction. Maybe the key to this whole story appears in the second paragraph, appears in a detail which sounds very technical. But I think Chazal were hinting at us something very, very deep, and the Maharal explains this. Right? There's two phrases which I've put in bold for you. This mum, the blemish that Bar Kamsa puts in the animal, where does he put the blemish? Either in the lips or in the eyes. And then the Gemara says, and it says something else. It says, this is something which is a blemish for us, but it's not a blemish for them. So by the way, I think there's a very deep message there as well. We're used to this double standard. The world looks at us, the world judges Israel in one way, judges the rest of the world another way. Okay, the way they judge us is unfair, and it's based on lies and deception and propaganda and hatred. Granted. But there should be a double standard. Meaning, that which is required of us, that which is sometimes is things that, right? HaKadosh Baruch Hu is very, we have a phrase in the Gemara says, HaKadosh Baruch Hu medaktekim im tzadikim, kechut ha'se'ara. The greater, the more righteous a person is, the harsher the judgment is. There is a certain standard. Sometimes we are required, we have a job to do, and we're required to uphold a higher standard to ourselves. But why the lips and why the eyes? Because that is the message. So much of the story, so much of the strife and the conflict between us comes from these two faculties. The lips, lashon hara. What do you say? What do you speak about? How do you talk? How do you talk about other people? The eyes, and there's two ways that you can talk about the eyes. You can talk about how we see each other, what we look for. Do we look at the positive, or do we always look to see the negative? Or sometimes, as we see in the story as well, sometimes we close our eyes when there are things that we should open our eyes. We should look at it. We should take a stand, and we should stand up, and we should speak out for injustice, which maybe we don't. So those two things, that's the message. Rav Tzadok has a beautiful idea. So we're now in Bein HaMetzarim, these 3 weeks. We have 3 special haftarot. What's called the Tlata de Puranuta. So the 3 special haftarot, each have a name, each have a word that begins. Last week, we read haftarah beginning with divrei. Divrei means words. The next one, the second haftarah, starts with shim'u, which means to hear. And the third one is Shabbat Chazon. Chazon is a vision. That is the key, says Rabbi Tzadok HaKohen Milublin. That is the key, that is the road map for the time of year that we're in and the way of getting out of it. It's based on divrei, how we speak. Shimu, how do we listen? So much in our society would be so different if we could correct this. And finally, how do we see? Chazon. What do we see? How do we see? Do we have a vision of who we are and where we are going and what we are trying to do? Have a look here on the page. Let me just say one other thing about this, about this idea of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa. The society, we see Parshat Dvarim. Parshat Dvarim, which we always read before Tisha B'Av. And one of the reasons, there's a pasuk near the beginning that says Eicha. Right? Eicha, which appears, of course, Megillat Eicha, appears in the Parsha, appears in the Haftarah as well. But Moshe Rabbeinu here is giving his parting message, and he's giving rebuke to the people over the mistakes that they've made. And he says, Eicha esa levadi tachachem masa'achem v'rivchem. He says, how could I stand by myself? I couldn't bear you, all your bother, all your burden, right, all your conflicts. And he talks here, he's giving them rebuke over the time when Yitro, Parashat Yitro comes to Moshe Rabbeinu. He says, you can't do this by yourself. Navol Tibol, you're going to stand all day, you're going to judge the people. You need help. You need to delegate people, you need to delegate a system under you. And he does. He says, Avo lachem anashim chachamim u'nevanim v'yiduim l'shiftachem v'asimem b'roshechem v'ta'anu oti. So that's what he said. And here Moshe Rabbeinu says to the people, he says, v'ta'anu oti v'tomu tova davar she'dibarta la'asot. He says, you all said, that's a good idea. Moshe Rabbeinu also said it's a good idea. The God said it's a good idea. The fact is that it was implemented. So why is that part of the rebuke? So there are different answers. But if you look at the next pasuk, so he says, "Ekach et roshei shiftechem, anashim chachamim v'yiduim, ve'eten otam lashim alechem sarei alafim, sarei me'ot, sarei chamishim, sarei asarot, ve'shotrim l'shiftechem." Right. So we have these people who are appointed, over 1,000 people, sarei alafim, sarei me'ot, appointed over 100 people, over 50 people, over 10 people. Says the Sforno, you understand here what the rebuke is? That you need a system of judges. Why do you need judges? Because people are coming, they have conflicts, they have arguments, they're having fights with one another. So you need a judge for every 10 people. And every 10 people you're having conflicts, what's going on? That's called the situation of Kamsa Bar Kamsa. So all these fights, all this machloket, over what? I mean, they were in the desert, what were they fighting about? Okay, but that's one of the things, that's the idea. So maybe to wrap up, And to end off, we see many, many things. The truth is there's a lot more, and there's much more that we could talk about over the story, but our time is limited. But these are some of the things that we see here. We see a picture of kamsa ubar kamsa. We see a picture of a society that is divided for the sake of division, of conflict, for the sake of conflict. We see where people are fighting against each other, not over ideas, not over values, but against individuals. And I view people and I view the other as somebody different, as somebody who is not part of my society, not part of my world. That is something very, very dangerous. How do we look at each other? And how do we look at the things that we see around us? Do we notice? Do we take care? We see something that doesn't quite look right, something that's going on. Do we stand up? Do we speak about it? Do we have something to say? Do we look at the negative, or are we able to look at the positive in one another? How do we speak about one another? Okay, do we have that false humility, Rabbi Yisrael? And of course, at the end of the day, you're in a situation, you're in an extreme situation, granted, but sometimes in an extreme situation, that's where you have to step up. That's where you have to step forward, particularly for leaders. Do we just let things go on as they are and do nothing? That is something which can have disastrous consequences as well. I want to just end off with one other thing, maybe for this time of year, maybe something for us to think about as we go away over the summer break, which is this. At the end of the day, all that we're talking about is Chava Yerushalayim. The essence of Tisha B'Av, at the end of the day, the mourning for the Mikdash, of mourning for Yerushalayim, is the desire to want to see it rebuilt. And the question is, how central is that in our lives? Do we care? How much do we care? How much do we notice? How much do we think about it? Is this number one on our priority list? Is this important in our values? And there's a story that I've heard from a number of soldiers who've come back from Gaza and have said, they went inside and they were fighting in Gaza, and one thing which they noticed, many things to notice there, but one thing they noticed, they said every single house that we went into every single house that we went into in Gaza had a picture of what they call Al-Aqsa, what we call Harabayit, of the Temple Mount, of Yerushalayim, right? What did they call the wall? They called it Tufan Al-Aqsa, they called it Jerusalem, they named it after Jerusalem. They attacked us in the Otef, they attacked us in the south, but the war was called the war over Jerusalem. They didn't forget. They didn't forget what the central thing is ultimately, what's the vision. And the question is, do we remember? Do we know that? Are we able to fight back? Are we able to have that central place for Jerusalem in our lives, for the rebuilding, for all the things that involves? And Bezrat Hashem, if each one of us can take to heart one, it's impossible to change everything at once. But if each one of us can take to heart one thing, one lesson that we learn, one area where I am going to improve, one flaw that I can correct, for the sake of Yerushalayim, Bezrat Hashem, we will merit very, very soon, and speedily in our days, that it should be rebuilt.